All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our LSAT free prep hour for July 2nd, 2018. My name is Scott Miller. I'm going to be your instructor today. I'm just going to say a quick hello. I'm based in Durham, North Carolina, and I teach LSAT classes here in this area. I also do private tutoring. I do a lot of teaching online for our company. When I'm not doing LSAT stuff, I'm usually at one of the local lakes, zooming around on a windsurfer or in a sailboat or something like that. I really love the LSAT. I think it's a fantastic test. I think it's a really, it's a very challenging test. It's very challenging to do well, and it's very challenging to be able to improve your score on the LSAT. But it's definitely possible. We have a lot of students that we work with who see pretty significant increases in their scores, but you know, it's a lot of work. And if you've been preparing for the LSAT already, then you know that. You know the amount of work that it takes. So for those who are here with us today, attending live. We are recording this, and we'll have the recordings available later on. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and dive in and start our session for today. So to get things started, I want to go ahead and mention one thing real quick for anybody who is preparing for the LSAT and wants to have some resources to use. We do have a lot of really good free resources on our website. And I'm going to go ahead and put a link in the chat window. You can go ahead and go to our resources page to learn about some of the free options, the free resources that we have available if you're studying for the LSAT. Let's talk about what we're doing tonight. So in tonight's session, we're going to cover, we're going to dive into arguments. We're going to talk about arguments on the LSAT. And we're going to talk about matching questions, the questions that people love to hate. We'll cover these different question types, and then we'll do probably a little bit of Q&A at the end to see if anybody has any questions about what we discussed or questions about the LSAT in general. But let's go ahead and get started on that. Before we do, just one thing real quick that I want to mention, if you are here live with us. So at the bottom of the your window, and if the window is like full screen and you really can't see anything else, or if you need to see, if you could find like the chat window that we're talking about, you can go ahead and press exit, the escape key to exit the full screen mode. So we do have a chat window, and if you just want to send like really quick messages, you can do that in the chat window. Like if I ask a question, you want to send a quick reply, you can do that in the chat window. If you want to ask questions, like a more detailed question about something, you can click on the Q&A box and send questions. And then you can click on if you can't find either of these, if you can't find the Q&A or the chat icon, then click on the three buttons that say more, the three dots that say more, and click on that button, and it'll usually show you the Q&A and chat if you can't see them. So yeah, that's just a little bit of information for our people who are here live today. So let's dive into our main topic of discussion. Let's talk about arguments on the LSAT. So a couple quick facts that you should know. 80% of all logical reasoning questions require you to understand the components of an argument. There are some questions that are going to directly test this, and they're going to directly ask you about a component of an argument. And the answer choices, your ability to answer correctly, is going to be based on your ability to say, identify what this certain component is. But beyond those questions that directly test your ability to identify the components of an argument, there are a whole wide range of other questions where this is the first step, where finding the components or understanding the components of an argument, understanding the structure of an argument, is going to be the first step. And then they're going to ask you to do something with that knowledge. They're going to ask you to strengthen the argument. They're going to ask you to weaken the argument. They're going to ask you about a flaw in the argument. But always in any of these questions, and if you've been prepping for the LSAT, then these questions are familiar to you. Always the first step in these questions is to identify the components of the argument. And if you skip that step, you can have a much harder time with the answer choices, a much harder time answering that question than you really should, or than you normally would. So this is one of the crucial things that we need to emphasize about the LSAT and about the LSAT in general, but especially about logical reasoning and especially about these questions that involve arguments, the upfront work that you do is really important. And you cannot underestimate the importance of doing this upfront work. So if you skip the upfront work, a lot of people, because of the time pressure, are eager to dive into the answer choices, right? You want to look at the answer choices and find the right answer. And the LSAT definitely rewards people who are willing to do a little bit of work up front and be a little bit patient in the beginning, and then use that upfront work to attack the answer choices much more effectively. So even though we're going to look at a specific question type today called matching questions, but we're going to use these questions, I'm going to show you how to use these questions as a way to improve your understanding of LSAT arguments in general. And the more you improve your understanding of LSAT arguments, the better you're going to do on the test overall. Because again, 80% of logical reasoning questions are going to test your ability to understand the components of the argument. 80% of all logical reasoning questions on some level or another are going to require you to do the things that we're talking about tonight and do them really quickly and do them accurately. And in many cases, then you're going to have to move on and do something else beyond what we're talking about tonight. Again, two scored logical reasoning sections in every LSAT. So that means 80% of LR is 40% of your total score. So let's keep rolling with this. So what's an argument? Let's pause and ask that first, because if we're going to talk about arguments, we need to have our definitions clear. If you want, in the chat window, do you want to give me a definition of an argument or an example of an argument? You can click on chat down there at the bottom of your screen. Give me an example or give me a definition. All right. The thing is, arguments, the word argument is used a lot of different ways, right? So we have a very specific definition on the LSAT. And on the LSAT, when we're talking about arguments, so exchanging opposite views is, I like what I'm seeing in the chat window here. That's an excellent answer. That's a more common everyday definition of the LSAT. And that's, two people who are having an argument have opposing views about something and they're exchanging their views. They're talking about those views, maybe in a very excited way, right? Maybe in a very animated way. But when we're talking about arguments on the LSAT, we're using a more specific definition. When we talk about an argument, we mean the use of a supporting premise to justify a conclusion. So great. What do those words mean? So a conclusion, we can say, is the main point of the argument, right? This is something that may be true or may be false. We're not really sure. We can say that the whole purpose of an argument, the whole reason for being of the argument, is to convince you that the conclusion is true. And the way they're going to do this is by presenting some kind of evidence, something to support the argument. So, or to support the conclusion, I should say. So if I say Hanu Rajanemi is an amazing science fiction author, therefore everyone should read his stories, that's an argument. All right. Now this last part right here, if I was just to give you this last part by itself, that's not an argument. That's just my opinion. Everyone should read this guy's stories. That's just an opinion. The thing that makes this an argument, and we don't actually have an argument unless we give you some kind of support, unless we give you some kind of premise. So if I say, oh, he's an amazing science fiction author, that's the evidence that I'm giving you to try to support, to try to convince you that this is actually true, that everyone should read his stories. And you need to have both of these things to have an argument. And anytime we're talking about an argument, we're interested in both of these parts. So what you'll often see if you're, if you take one of our classes, or if you're if you subscribe to the brief email series, you can get to that. You can subscribe to that through the free resources page on our website. You look at any of our materials, we talk a lot about the argument core. And what the argument core is basically this, what we've just described. We're taking the conclusion that whoever's making this argument wants you, the thing that whoever's making this argument wants you to believe, we're taking that conclusion and then we are giving you the support, the evidence for it, the premise and the conclusion. And another good way to think about this, another, I think really useful way to think about this very lawyerly way to think about this, right, is that the premise is the evidence and the conclusion is the verdict. Right? So imagine you're at a trial. The premise is the evidence that you're presenting, the facts. And the conclusion is the verdict that you want the jury to reach. And one of the things you're going to have to do on the LSAT is debate arguments. So you might be thinking of all kinds of ways to debate this argument, and you know, maybe you're seeing some holes in this argument, which is great. That means you're thinking the way you need to on the LSAT. But in order to do this, you know, the LSAT is not going to give you this. The LSAT's not going to give you you know, some kind of really straightforward presentation of the argument core like this, just the premise and the conclusion by themselves, and say, hey, do something with this. What they're going to do is give you a little paragraph to read, right? They're going to give you the argument core kind of hidden in a paragraph. And this is the way that logical reasoning questions, you know, they'll start off. And so if you notice here, the actual argument itself, the argument core, is at the end. Therefore, everyone should read his stories. That's my conclusion. Premise is right before it. That Hanu Rajamani is an amazing science fiction author. So what about this other stuff? Anybody want to tell me in the chat window? You can click on chat down there at the bottom of the screen. And if you want, what is the rest of this that we see before the word however? Right? So we're saying the conclusion, the thing that if I'm the one making this argument, right, the thing that I want you to walk away believing, the thing I'm trying to convince you is true, is that everyone should read his stories. The evidence I'm providing to try to convince you of that, the premise, is that he's an amazing science fiction author. What about these first two statements? What are they? Anybody have any ideas in the chat window? You can click chat down there at the bottom of your screen, and for those who are here in person. What about this first sentence? He's a Finnish author living in Oakland, California. What relation does that have to the conclusion? Does it have any relation at all? So not really, right? The fact that he's a Finnish author living in Oakland, California doesn't really, you know, the thing that I'm trying to use to convince you that you should read his story is that he's an amazing science fiction author. The fact that he's a Finnish author living in Oakland, California, I mean, maybe if you're Finnish or maybe if you're in Oakland, California, then maybe that would convince you that, oh yeah, I should read him. You know, he's one of our folks here. But really, we would call this background information, right? It's pretty neutral. And it's not necessarily by itself going to convince anyone that they should read his stories necessarily. So this is what we call background information. It's one of the things that you're going to see in an argument that you may or may not be that interested in. But the reason we're calling it background is because it's neutral. It's not trying to support the conclusion. It's not convincing us that the conclusion is true. But it's also not, you know, contradicting the conclusion or anything like that. Now, this next statement, many of my friends have never read anything that he has written. What's the relationship between that and the conclusion? Many of my friends have never read anything that he's written compared to my conclusion that everyone should read his stories. What's the relationship there? They kind of oppose each other, right? They kind of contradict each other. Yeah, contradiction, exactly. So we would call this an opposing point. An opposing point, again, the role, we'll just say OP for short here, opposing point. The role of an opposing point is basically to be beaten up by the conclusion. And this is a really common pattern in LSAT, these little paragraphs they give you in logical reasoning, right? So, you know, they might give you both. They might give you some background. They might give you an opposing point. They might just give you one or the other. But very often you're going to see these paragraphs start with some kind of an opposing point, something that the conclusion ultimately contradicts. And that can be kind of useful because, you know, if you recognize that pattern, if you recognize that they're starting off with something and then something later on actually seems to oppose that or contradict it, that's an indication that one of those things is probably the conclusion. So one of the things to get used to as you're reading is to be able to, you start off with kind of a hypothesis, right? I mean, this is the way that I read these paragraphs when the LSAT gives them to me. And I found it's a pretty effective way to do it. So you read the first sentence and you say, well, what is this probably? It sounds kind of just like background information. The fact that he's a Finnish author living in Oakland, California, that doesn't really move me very much. Many of his friends have never read anything or many of my friends have never read anything that he's written. Okay. However, now this word however is actually really useful. This small word, we often read right past words like this when we're reading, normally, right? Everyday reading. But these words become really powerful on the LSAT, and you should always sit up and take notice. However tells me when I'm reading this paragraph that I'm probably transitioning to the argument core. Very, very likely that now I'm transitioning to the actual heart of the argument here. The fact that he's an amazing science fiction writer, therefore everyone should read his stories. And the therefore is really important too, right? Another word that we very often will just read right by and not really take notice of. On the LSAT, you need to notice these words like so, thus, therefore. I mean, what it actually does, what it literally does, just grammatically, is therefore means because of what I just told you, I want you to believe this next thing. Right? However doesn't quite do that. However just says, hey, we're going to contradict what we were just saying. We're going to do something that goes against what we were just saying. Therefore actually shows you the link between premise and conclusion, the thing that's really important that you want to be looking for. So as you start reading these paragraphs, just start off, read the first sentence. What do I think that is? Does it sound like the conclusion? Sometimes you'll see the conclusion right in the very first line of the argument or the paragraph. So is that the conclusion? Is it background information? What is it? And then as you continue reading each sentence, think, what do I think is the relationship between what I'm reading now and what I just read? If you have these transition words, pivot words like however, yet, but, notice them. If you have these words like therefore that indicate a conclusion, you got to notice them. You want to notice them. And then you end up, by the time you've read the whole thing, maybe you have just an idea of what the conclusion is. That's great, actually. If you're reading, this is obviously a really simple example, right, that we're giving you. But if you're reading a more complicated paragraph, then at least, hopefully, you'll have an idea what the conclusion is. But and then you can go back and I mean, don't be afraid to go back and read one more time. And now if you have this hypothesis about what the conclusion is, then you should be able to identify what everything else is based on its relationship to the conclusion. This doesn't convince me that the conclusion is true. It doesn't, go against the conclusion. It's just background neutral. This seems to be what the conclusion is trying to contradict. Okay, that's my opposing point. This, because the therefore, that tells me that this is my, not it could be an opinion, but it tells me this is the support that we're trying to use to prove, or the evidence we're trying to use to prove that this conclusion is true. So this is always your first step. Again, 80% of logical reasoning questions are going to test your ability. The first thing they're going to test is your ability to do this, what we're just doing right now, and to do it really well. So if you're kind of nodding your head saying, yeah, this is a review, this is great, I kind of know this, that's great. Because not only do you want to understand it, you want to be really good at it. You want to get to the point where if I was to show you an argument, you could read it once, maybe you have to read a couple parts again, and immediately do what I just did here on the screen, which is clearly tag and identify every single piece of this. This is my conclusion. This is the support, the premise. This is an opposing point. This is background information. And do it that fast, because that's where your speed is going to come from on the LSAT. All right. Any questions? Like I said, you guys, you can fire them away in the chat window, or you can click the Q&A button and send some questions that way if you like. I'm just going to kind of keep rolling through this stuff, but this is just some background, maybe a review of what we mean by arguments, the argument core, the premise, and the conclusion. The main thing whoever's making this argument is trying to convince you this is true. The way they're doing it is by presenting this evidence. And how do you extract that from these little paragraphs they give you? All right, so let's keep rolling. Let's move on to our main thing that I promised we were going to talk about tonight, which is matching questions. And this is, if you're wondering why this is so blurry, it's intentionally blurry, right? We're not going to go over this question. I don't want you reading this question. I'm just using this as an example of the first thing that you see when you turn the page and see a matching question, right? If you've been practicing for the LSAT, if you've done a practice test or been studying a little bit, you know the deal with these matching questions, right? They're gigantic. They take up a whole half a page. And a lot of people will skip these because of that, right? Because they're so big and because they're so complicated, because they take up so much, they take time, right? You can't deny that. You can't deny that these matching questions can take a lot of time. But they don't always take a lot of time, and they're not always that difficult. So what I'm hoping to show you tonight is two things. I'm hoping you're gonna take away two things and improve your understanding of these matching questions in two ways. One way is to maybe walk away with some techniques for tackling them effectively. And so that maybe, instead of just going past it or skipping it, which a lot of people do, right? And it's not a bad thing to do, is to skip the matching questions. They do take a lot of time. But what I'm hoping is you'll maybe find a little bit of fortitude and curiosity about the matching questions and try to tackle them using the techniques that we talk about tonight. And the other thing that I want you to be able to do is use matching questions as a tool to improve your understanding of arguments in general, to improve your ability to answer those 80% of logical reasoning questions that deal with arguments. So not only, do I want to understand how to answer these questions, but I want to use them as a tool. I'm going to use them to get some leverage on the rest of logical reasoning. So the way you're dealing with a matching question, other than the fact that it's gigantic and takes up half the page, is you'll see the question stem, right? Which of the following arguments is most similar in its reasoning to the argument above? And this is one of the reasons why matching questions can be time-consuming and maybe a little intimidating, because not only do you have to read an argument up here in the stimulus, but every one of these answer choices is in and of itself a complete argument. So you have not just the argument in the stimulus in the little paragraph at the top, but you have these 5 other arguments that we have to look at to try to answer the question. And again, this can be why they're difficult, but this is also why they provide such a great opportunity for you to improve your understanding of LSAT arguments, because you have 5 arguments here right in this one question that you can look at and analyze the way we just did that last sample argument. Right? So this just, if you understand how important arguments are in the LSAT and you're saying, man, I'm really not that good at understanding arguments and picking out the pieces like you just did, finding the conclusion, use a couple of these matching questions and just don't worry about answering the question. Look at the stimulus and then look at each answer choice and just use it as a drill. Let me just break down and understand what's the conclusion, what are the premises, how do these go together? Another version of these is going to ask you to do something that we're commonly asked to do on other LSAT questions, which is understand flaws in arguments. So, remember I said, we all, and you know this if you've been practicing for the LSAT, some questions are going to ask you to directly just like, what's the conclusion of the argument? Directly identify the components. But a lot of questions are going to ask you to do something with the understanding of the structure of the argument. Find a flaw, strengthen the argument, weaken it. So you'll see some of these matching questions give you a question stem like this. Which one of the following uses flawed reasoning that most closely resembles the flawed reasoning used in the argument above? So not only are we trying to find the argument that matches, we're trying to understand the flaw in the argument and find the one that has the matching flaw. But these are we call both of these matching questions. Match the reasoning is the basic kind, where you're just trying to see which argument matches the argument above. Match the flaw, that's the type where you're trying to understand the flaw in the argument and match that as well. All right, so how do these work? So the first thing you're going to do, and we're going to use example questions here from the June 2007 LSAT. This is the one that LSAC publishes on their website, and you can download for free. The reason we use this is because, if somebody's just watching this and they haven't bought a bunch of books and stuff, if you still want to be able to follow along and go back and look at this question yourself later on, you have the ability to download this question from the questions we use tonight from that LSAC June 2007 prep test, and you can download that for free and look at these again, review these again. So in these matching questions, like we said, we're going to have an argument up here. But before you read this little paragraph, before you read the stimulus, I always encourage people to read I'm a big fan of this, right? I'm a big fan of reading the question stem first. And maybe you've been following this, heated LSAT debate. Should you read the question first, or should you read the paragraph first? I'm a big fan of reading the question first because for two reasons. Different questions are going to ask you to do different things. And I want to understand exactly what I'm supposed to be doing before I go and read the paragraph. And just simply the fact that I'm going to be doing different things with these questions makes me tend to want to know what I'm doing first. But even more importantly, depending on what my task is, depending on the job I'm supposed to be doing, I'm going to read this differently. If this was, for example, a question that's asking me to find an assumption in the argument, I'm going to read it and look for an argument. If this is asking me like what we call to which of the following is most strongly supported, or if the statements above are true, which of the following must be true, that's a totally different type of question. I'm not even really looking for an argument in that type of question. So it's going to be really helpful for you to understand what, certain types of questions you are looking for arguments, other types of questions you're not looking for arguments. You're not going to look for a premise and a conclusion when you're reading this. So being able to read the question stem and know what your job is, know whether you're looking for an argument or not, is really useful. And then you go and look at this little paragraph they give you. So I want everybody to read this and do what we just did a moment ago. Find the conclusion, find the premises. I'll give everybody a few seconds to do this. Okay. So we have a nice keyword here, right? Therefore, that tells us that I'm about to see a conclusion. And again, you don't want to skip over these words like therefore. Think of some other words that indicate you're about to see a conclusion. What other words indicate you're about to see a conclusion? Thus, so, all right? There are quite a few of them. Hence. And I say, we read right past these because normally when we're reading, we're more interested in the content, right? We're more interested in Rose's dogs, Labrador, St. Bernard. And so these words just kind of like fade into the background. But on the LSAT, they give you really important information. It's telling me that this last sentence here is my conclusion, and the sentence that comes before it is the premise. The sentence that comes before it, therefore, tells me that the sentence that comes before it is somehow supporting that conclusion. So as I'm looking at this, I say again, just like we did before. So what are these first two sentences? All Labrador Retrievers bark a great deal. All St. Bernards bark infrequently. Each of Rose's dogs is a cross between a Labrador Retriever and a St. Bernard. Now, you might look at that and say, okay, those first two sentences kind of sound like background information. But one of the things you always want to ask yourself is, do those first two sentences provide some information that seems to help me get to the conclusion, right? So you almost you really want to put yourself in the shoes when you're first reading an argument. Don't try to debate it, right? Don't look for what's wrong with it. Just try to understand it. You want to put yourself in the shoes of the person making the argument, right? Or you're their friend, trying to help them out. Like whoever wrote the argument is like, hey, can you help me with my argument? I'm having trouble with my argument. And you're like, oh, okay, sure. Let me help you. And the first thing you want to do is understand what they're trying to do first, right? Before you try to figure out what's going on, you got to understand what they're trying to do first. So that's the way you read arguments. Try to understand it first. Try to put yourself in the shoes of the person who's making this argument. So if this last part is my conclusion, and then I have this sentence before it that's a premise. So notice that those first two sentences seem like they would help get me to that conclusion, right? My conclusion, Rose's dogs are moderate barkers. How do I know that? Each of Rose's dogs is a cross between a Labrador Retriever and a St. Bernard. That's my premise. Well, what does this say about barking, right? So one of the important things to notice is that there's a new idea in the conclusion of barking that was never mentioned in this premise here about the cross between Labrador Retriever and St. Bernard. And notice that these two sentences actually do give me information about barking. So that's going to tell me right away that I'm going to treat those as premises because they're giving me information that's not included in my thing I've identified as a premise, and they're giving me information that helps this premise get to that conclusion. So I'm going to treat those as premises too. And I'll often do that. You'll see like in the margins when I'm working on an LSAT on my paper, you'll see me like put C's and P's when I'm just reminding myself, what is each piece of this? This is my conclusion. These are my premises. Okay. So we've identified the pieces of the argument. We have 3 premises and a conclusion. So remember, our job here that we're trying to do is identify not just the reasoning, but the flawed reasoning. So they're telling us right up front that there's a flaw in this argument. Now, so if I was actually answering this question on the LSAT, trying to answer the question correctly, that my next step, now that I've identified the pieces, is I want to see what's wrong with this argument. Okay, I've put myself in the shoes of the person making the argument. Now what's wrong with it? Now let me pick it apart. Little Jekyll and Hyde move here, right? So you're going to turn into Mr. Hyde and say, what's wrong with this argument? So everybody take a moment and think about that. Anybody who wants to in the chat window, tell me, what do you see is wrong with this argument? Now, does it sound good? Retrievers bark a great deal. St. Bernards bark infrequently. These dogs are a cross, so they're probably going to be moderate. I don't know. And sometimes you look at an argument and you don't see right away anything's wrong with it. So let me give you an example maybe of something, an example that might help. If I say, so hydrogen is flammable. Oxygen makes things burn faster, let's say. Okay. Does anybody know what H2O is? It's water. Puts out fires. Right? So just because hydrogen is flammable and oxygen makes things burn faster, if we combine the two together into H2O, water, it doesn't mean that whatever the individual properties are doesn't tell us anything about what the combined result is going to be. So that's the problem here, right? Just because we know something about each of these individual types of dogs, we don't really know what happens when we cross them, when they get bred together. So we can't make this prediction based on the individual characteristics of the individual origins here. That's the problem with the argument. That's the flaw in the argument. So now we know everything that we need to know. We know there are 2 ways we could use this. If I'm just using this question as like a drill to review the process for dealing with arguments on the LSAT, I've just done what I'm going to have to do with a large portion, with arguments that ask you to find an assumption, with arguments that ask you to strengthen, with arguments that ask you to weaken, with arguments that ask you to find a flaw, with arguments that ask you which principle most supports the argument above. These are the steps you follow. You identify the pieces of the argument, you ask yourself what's wrong with it, and then, and only then, are you ready to answer the questions. And a big problem that people have is they don't do this preliminary work first. They don't, a lot of people, and this can be a significant trap. If you're one of the people who are scoring in like the 160s, I see these people get trapped a lot by this. You may be getting a certain number of questions right on the LSAT based on just like an intuitive overall understanding of the argument. So you might be able to get this question right. You might be able to spot, a flaw in this argument and get the answer correct. You might be able to, if this is a strengthen question, you might be able to spot which answer strengthens without actually being able to break the argument down in its component parts. And the problem is that you may then, kind of rely on that intuitive understanding, but there are a certain number of questions that you're not going to be able to get correct, because getting those correct in a reasonable amount of time relies on you clearly understanding the parts. So don't think that just because you're, like scoring in the 160s and doing well overall with LR, that you can ignore what we're talking about here, that it's just, oh yeah, this is really simple stuff. I don't have to do this. This is where your speed's going to come from. Having a clear understanding of an argument and the flaw in the argument before you look at the answer choices is where a lot of your speed, it's going to let you work efficiently and let you avoid mistakes when you go to the answer choices. So again, in this particular question, we're being asked, this is a matching question, right? We're not being asked to strengthen or anything like that. We're being asked which of the answer choices most closely resembles the flawed reasoning used in the argument above. So what we're going to do now is look at each answer choice. And again, I'm going to show you this from 2 perspectives. I'm going to show you this from the perspective of just using these matching questions as a drill. If you're thinking, I'm not really sold on the idea that I should be doing these matching questions. I'm kind of, they kind of still seem a little funky to me. you can still use them as a drill to try to understand and practice what we're talking about. So I want you to look at it from that perspective first. I want you to look at answer choice A here, and I want you to just do what we've been doing. I want you to identify the core of the argument. I want you to identify the conclusion, premises. Make sure you have everything accounted for, right? Make sure there's something and it looks like background information. Take another look at it. Make sure that it is actually background and not a premise. I'll give everybody a moment to do. All right, so conclusion, therefore, like we've been talking about, we have this nice conclusion indicator, this word therefore down at the bottom. So therefore, Jane makes somewhat good grades. When I read that, I'm pretty sure that's my conclusion. Jane studies, some students who do not study diligently make good grades. Jane studies somewhat diligently. Jane studies somewhat diligently. Okay, that sounds like a premise. That would maybe convince me why she makes somewhat good grades. Some students who do not study diligently also make good grades. So this is kind of, it's similar to what we saw earlier, right? It's not that different, where these all seem to be premises. All students who study diligently make good grades. Some students who do not study diligently also make good grades. Jane studies somewhat diligently, therefore Jane makes somewhat good grades. This is a very similar structure to what we saw in our stimulus, right? 3 premises leading up to a conclusion. And it seems similar, right? Notice the conclusion is really similar, that Jane makes somewhat good grades. We're kind of putting Jane in the middle, just like Rose's dogs are somewhat in the middle. I'm wondering if you haven't seen it already. Okay, so now we understand what the argument is about. If you wanted to take this one step further, then you could say, like, what's wrong with the argument? Jane studies somewhat diligently. So we know about students who study diligently. We know about students who do not study diligently. We know a lot about people making good grades. Jane studies somewhat diligently. Do we know anything about making somewhat good grades? So notice that this argument is introducing actually a completely new idea in the conclusion. None of our premises have told us about how someone makes, we know how people make good grades, or we know what people can make good grades or do make good grades, but how do we, like, what are our premises telling us about making somewhat good grades, like moderating that a little bit, pulling back on that a little bit? So you might look at this and say, oh yeah, this seems like a good match, but we need to remember what our original argument said. And I'll be honest, in terms of process, in terms of how you approach this, we're talking about working wrong to right here. So what I would probably do if I was working on this question myself is I would read answer choice A, and I would understand what the, based on the structure of this argument, I would probably defer on A. When I first look at answer choices, I don't try to prove to myself that they're right, and I don't try to prove to myself that they're wrong. What I'm doing when I first look at answer choices is asking myself, can I see clearly that it's wrong? Do I see anything wrong with it? And the answer here might be no, and I might just move on from answer choice A and leave it. I'm wondering, though, does anybody see a difference between, a significant difference between these two answers, the answer choice A and the argument that we were given in the stimulus? Hudson says premise 2. Yep. Some students who do not, so, and there might be a few things about premise 2 that you don't like. So do not, like that doesn't seem to match. And I guess maybe infrequently could be like not frequently, but notice that my premises here are all premises, all Labrador retrievers, all St. Bernards. And so we have these almost like extremes, like 2 definites. And then we're saying, well, because Rose's dogs are kind of in between the definites, then the behavior must be in between. So right away, when I see some students who do not study diligently also make good grades, that would be like some dogs that are not Labrador retrievers also bark a great deal? I don't know. Like, you would have to really change one or the other of these premises to make it a match. So if I had noticed that right off the bat, then I would eliminate answer choice A. But that's the only thing I'm thinking about when I first look at answer choices is, do I notice something right away that makes me want to eliminate A? If you're not noticing something right away that makes you eliminate A, then I would not spend any time trying to prove that A is right. I'm just seeing if I can spot something right away that makes it wrong. That's always the first thing I'm thinking about when I look at answer choices. If I didn't notice that, I would defer on A and move on. All right, so now let's look at answer choice B. And I want you to do the same thing with answer choice B. I want you to just look at the answer choice first, identify the argument core, and don't worry about comparing it. Just understand what it's doing first. Understand the argument first. Find the conclusion in the premises. Give everybody a moment to do that. So we notice again, therefore, our conclusion indicator, right, should jump out at us. This household and moderately toxic, right, kind of in the middle. And notice that the premises right off the bat look good. All type A chemicals, all type B chemicals, a mixture of the two. So I have the same kind of structure. I'm looking at Hudson's question in the chat window. Good, I'll go back to that in a moment. So what I'm looking at with answer choice B here is that this is actually looks like a pretty good match. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm just not seeing anything wrong with it really quickly. So I would defer on this and move on. I wouldn't eliminate it. I would defer on it and move on, right? Not try to prove to myself it's right. Just say, hey, it could be right. So let me move on. Let me go back to the previous answer choice and see. I'm not really sure I'm see what you're saying. R says some students do the same thing that the first premise did. Yeah, exactly. That is another factor. It's like I was saying. This is I see exactly what you're saying, Hudson. This is about making good grades, as is our first premise. There's no difference between the two. So yeah, that's another reason to eliminate. Exactly. Notice there are two or three things that could have stood out at you or could have jumped out at you with answer choice A that could have caused you to eliminate it. Good. So let's go on to the next answer choice. We've maybe eliminated A if you notice those differences. If not, we would just defer. We're keeping B around because it looks pretty good. So now we're going to go to answer choice C. Look at answer choice C. So I'm reading it. Okay, this seems like a premise. This next sentence seems like a premise. Okay. Now, so if I read this argument, if you read this argument, this answer choice C, we see a nice therefore, right? And so conclusion indicator. And I would probably read this conclusion and eliminate C right away. Like as soon as I read the conclusion, some members of one group do one thing and some members of that group do the other. So I'm not even worried about whether this argument has the same flaw because it's a radically different conclusion, right? A conclusion that one person's something is a mix of two things is very different from saying that some of one group are something and some of another group are a different thing. I mean, just on kind of first glance, this conclusion is saying something about all of Rose's dogs. We're not splitting Rose's dogs into two groups and saying some are moderate barkers and some like to bury bones in the backyard, right? I mean, it's all about Rose's dogs all being moderate barkers, all being the middle of these two things. So a conclusion that, and this is a really nice thing. Remember I said earlier, matching questions sometimes are not really that intimidating. You can answer them pretty quickly. So the nice thing that happens sometimes is the conclusion is such a mismatch for the original conclusion that you can eliminate an answer right away, just based on that really glaring mismatch. I say glaring, but if you're not good at that initial step of breaking down an argument into component parts, recognizing this is a conclusion. And also, I think for it to be glaring, you have to understand what you're trying to do in these matching questions. You have to understand what your job is, and that your job is to, you're comparing arguments. You're comparing the structure of these arguments. You're breaking these arguments down, looking at the premises and the conclusions, and saying, is it the same basic structure, and does it exhibit the same flaw? And just if there's such a big difference in the conclusion of an argument compared to in a conclusion of an answer choice compared to the initial argument, it's going to be really hard for this to have just the same flaw. So I would be comfortable eliminating C. There can be some I'm going to tell you what's going to happen sometimes. I'm going to give you a caveat to that. Sometimes you're going to do this and say, oh yeah, some and some, totally wrong, and eliminate all 5. Eliminate all 5 answer choices. It's going to happen sometimes in match the flaw questions. Not a lot. Most of the time, if you eliminate an answer choice to a match the flaw question based on a glaring mismatch like this, you're doing the right thing. But if you do happen to eliminate all 5 answer choices and go, wow, what did I just do? What you want to do is go back and look at the original question again, look at the original, the stimulus, look at the original argument, understand what the flaw is, and then just forget about structure, read each answer choice and see if you spot one that has the same flaw, even if the structure looks really different. Those are pretty rare questions, but I'm just telling you what to do if you do run into one, right? It's only worth 1 point. Every one of these questions is, and that's the whole thing to remember about LSAT questions. I'm going to go off on a little tangent here. Every LSAT question is worth 1 point. So if I'm talking about a process that applies to the majority of matching questions, like this process that I'm showing you right here, breaking down, understanding the argument core, identifying the conclusion, identifying the premises, looking for these obvious mismatches, this is going to apply to a really wide range and a large number of matching questions. It'll get you to the correct answer. And it's really easy to go, oh yeah, but this one question over here, that doesn't work. You're right. It doesn't work. So you're going to make a decision of like, do I have time to apply a different strategy and look for how this question is different and deal with it? But I think a lot of people focusing, a lot of people get in the habit of focusing on what's different about questions and how this one question over here is so different from all these other questions. And really, you're much better off looking for similarities, trying to understand procedures that work time and time again on question after question after question. And yeah, sometimes they're not going to work, but there are actually 3 or 4 matching questions on like every section. Every LSAT, would have 3 or 4, maybe 2 or 3 in each section. So don't worry about the occasional ones that don't quite fit the pattern. First, get really comfortable with the processes that we're talking about, like these processes that do work for a wide range of questions. Get good at those. Get the more common questions correct. And if you do that, you're probably going to have a good idea of how to tackle the unusual ones just by modifying that process a little bit. Learn the common, learn to do what's common first and then deal with the outliers. All right, so let's keep going with this. I'm going to show you another answer choice here. Let you read this answer choice. Answer choice D delta. And again, we're not really worried about comparing to the original first. We just want to understand this one. So by this point, maybe this argument looked really good all the way up until the end. So my conclusion, therefore, Bob knows both, whoops, that's not going to do it. My conclusion, therefore, Bob knows both shorthand and calculus. That's a little different. Like, I would be really suspicious of this. I like that it has an all one thing and all a different thing, and then Bob is a combination of both. But it's not saying Bob is in the middle of something. Like Bob is halfway good at shorthand and halfway good at calculus. Like maybe that would be better. I don't even know if that would be that good. But I'm really suspicious of D. I would be tempted to eliminate D right now because it's saying Bob is has both of these in full amount, right? He has shorthand in full amount and calculus, knowledge of shorthand and knowledge of calculus. He has both, not that he's somewhere in the middle. It's not the same. It's not like saying Rose's dogs can bark a great deal sometimes and bark infrequently other days. I don't know, like that would make this a better match. So I'd get rid of D. I'd be really getting rid of D right away. Now we go to answer choice E, echo. Let's look at this one. Let's look at again, find the argument core, find the conclusion, understand what the premises are. Do that first. So we have all in all. Again, notice how a lot of these start out looking really good. I think that's one of the ways they try to confuse you, is they want you to think that all of these answer choices are so similar because they all start out really similar. A lot of them will start out really similar. So all these are well made, all these are badly made. That's opposite. And then we have half of the dresses in this closet are well made and half are badly made. Half are Kenishas and half are Connies. Okay. So again, this conclusion seems really different to me. It's not saying like, you know, Jordan's dress, half of Jordan's dress was made by Kenisha and half of Jordan's dress was made by Connie. So it's sort of well made, right? That would be a better match, right? We would need a premise that says like this one dress was half made by one person and half made by the other. So that must mean that, you know, it's a little bit of each. So again, E, echo is out of there. Echo is elimination. So notice what we've just did here. Well, notice what we just did, what we have just done. We found reasons to eliminate, pretty good reasons to eliminate 3 of these answers. In fact, if you count A, like I was giving A the benefit of the doubt because I'm not sure everybody might notice right away what makes answer choice A different. But really, answer choice A does have a significant difference that would cause us to eliminate it. And beyond that, C, D, E, and E all have big differences in the conclusion. Differences in the conclusion that make them really suspect, that would make it really tempting to eliminate them, or very likely to eliminate them. So by process of elimination, I can get down to answer choice B, bravo, the correct answer, which does match. But notice we didn't really have to think very much about whether B is right to get to the right answer. We're more focused on eliminating other answers that are wrong, more focused on eliminating answers that where we can find mismatches, find things that are significantly different from the structure of our original argument. All right. So what I'd like you to do is think about some takeaways. I'd like you to think about some takeaways, some things that we talked about tonight, if anything, that will help you be more successful in logical reasoning. Anything that, you know, we talked about in terms of arguments at the beginning, we talked about arguments in general. And every one of these, you know, answer choices, the stimulus, and every one of these answer choices we looked at, we were dealing with an argument and analyzing an argument. We're talking specifically about how to use this process of understanding, identifying the argument core, having a clear idea of what the premise and the conclusion is, and seeing how the answer choices, like one of those components is a clear mismatch for in 4 of the answer choices, one of those components is a clear mismatch for our original stimulus. And again, I think this is an example, and probably this is why some people have trouble with matching questions, because I think if you're looking at a matching question and all you're doing is like trying to take in the whole thing, it's such a tempting thing to do. And I'll go back to this blurry one again, because I'm just using a really general example here and not anything specific. But it's really tempting to try to rush by just taking this all in and wrapping your head around the whole thing. And then each answer choice, you're trying to read the whole thing, step back, think about the whole thing, and say, is it a match? When really it's a case of breaking things down piece by piece. And what I'm going to say is, if you're going to, you know, if you're going to spend any time on these questions at all, any time on a matching question, you have to invest time in understanding the stimulus. You have to do what we did with the stimulus and break it down, understand the argument core, and try to see how the pieces fit together. Because if you don't do that, then you're not really going to have much of a chance of quickly and accurately understanding what's wrong with the other answer choices, with the answer choices. You're not going to be able to spot these mismatches that let you eliminate answer choices. And you'll have a hard time understanding why one of them is right. They're just all going to look similar. So take the time, if you're going to invest any time at all in these questions, take the time to understand the stimulus, break it down the way we've been talking about here. Then look at the answer choices. Sometimes if I'm in a big hurry, I might like skip matching questions and then go back to them at the end. And maybe if I only have a couple minutes left, I'm just going to try to knock this out as fast as I can. Notice how we were able to eliminate 4 answer choices on this question we looked at just because the conclusions didn't match. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're like really in a hurry when you're tackling one of these matching questions and you're just trying to get out of there as soon as you can, a good way to do that is to just look at the stimulus, understand what the conclusion is of the stimulus, and then just quickly check answer choices for conclusions and eliminate ones where the conclusion doesn't match. And sometimes you'll be surprised. On easier versions, you can eliminate 4 answer choices because the conclusions don't match. You might be able to eliminate 3. And then maybe you just quickly take a quick look at the premises and see if, you can eliminate one or the other of the remaining answer choices based on the premises. But this is a way to quickly, take a quick shot at tackling one of these, even if you don't have time or you don't want to spend the time to, to dig all the way into it. Sometimes I'm really happy to eliminate 3 answer choices based on conclusion mismatches and then take a 50-50 guess. It doesn't take long to do that. And I have a good shot at answering the question correctly that way. All right. So what I'd like to do for the remaining few minutes, and so again, think about anything you want to remember from this, any takeaways that you have. What I would like you to do is, or what I'll ask you to do if you want, is in the chat window or in the Q&A, if you have any questions, either in the Q&A or in the chat window, either one. If you have any questions about what we talked about, or if you have any questions about the LSAT in general, we have a couple minutes left, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have in those last couple minutes. Okay, so we have a question in the chat window, or sorry, the Q&A window. What is a typical Manhattan Live Online course like? So a typical Manhattan Prep Live Online course is a lot like this in that we do them in Zoom. We are starting to do them in Zoom. We still have some courses that are in Blackboard right now, but we are starting to do these in Zoom. We do kind of similar to what we did here, except the courses are a little more interactive. So with these webinars, we're not really taking the time to make sure everybody knows how to use all the tools and stuff. We're trying to cover things a little bit faster in these webinars sometimes than we do in the courses. So the bottom line is the difference between a course and what you would see here is the class sessions are 3 hours long. That's one difference. Here we're just doing a quick, hitting one topic in an hour. We do tend to go in a lot deeper into the content. And part of the reason for that is because you'll have time before class sessions. Like before we do a class session on matching, before we do the actual class session on matching, you would be doing homework in one of our courses to prepare yourself for that. To prepare yourself, where you learn kind of the stuff that we talked about here. You learn that on your own first, and make sure you have an idea of what the key concepts are. And then what we do in class is we tend to go over questions and get you doing a lot more of the work. We're going to ask a lot more questions from the students, get the students debating things, talking about things. Whereas in this free prep hour, we just kind of try to throw some information at you and explain things. Whether or not you've ever studied the LSAT before, or whether or not you've done anything beforehand to prepare. We're not giving you homework to do to prepare, whereas in the courses we do. And so we can go a lot more in depth in the class sessions to help you understand these concepts and go over, usually we go over a greater number of questions in the class sessions. One thing you can do if you're interested is we do have, you can check out our upcoming courses. Because the nice thing about our courses is you can attend for free online. So I'll put this link in the chat window. That way, if you want to attend one of our courses for free, attend one of our classes for free. Let me not say courses, because it's session 1 of the class. If you sign up for one of our free trial classes, what that lets you do is attend the first session, session 1, for free, see what the class is like, decide if you want to stick around or not for the whole 10-session course. The trial class is an actual session 1 of our LSAT of our 10-session LSAT class. So you get to see exactly what it's like. Any other questions? We have like 1 minute left. Who would benefit from a Manhattan Prep course? So I think in terms of who would benefit from the course, our courses work really well for people who are in two categories. People who are trying to get a high score. If you're trying to score in the 160s or above, or if you're looking for a significant increase in your score. And the reason I say that is, if you're looking for a 10-point or more increase in your score, our courses work really well for people like that. And the reason I say that is because we make you work. You are going to have a lot of homework to do. We're going to ask you to participate really heavily in the class. This is more like this session has been more of me just asking some quick questions in the chat window, trying to get you guys to, throw a few quick responses in. But in the classes, in the actual online classes, we do have you do a lot more work. So, and the reason for that is because if you're looking for a high score, or if you're looking for a significant increase in your score, you really have to practice the LSAT. So this is my last little last thing, and then we'll call it a night. So the LSAT isn't really testing what you remember. The LSAT is testing skills. If you look back at everything we did tonight, looking at this question, it's all about specific skills. How do you identify the conclusion of an argument? How do you identify the premises? How do you make sure you know what everything else is? Once you've identified that, how do you use that knowledge to evaluate answer choices? What's your process? And these are all things that you can hear and read, but if you don't practice them, you're not going to be able to do them as quickly as you need to on test day under actual conditions to get a high score. So that's why practice is really important. And that's what our classes are designed to do, is help you learn how to practice effectively. We give you a lot of information. We show you a lot and we explain a lot, but really what we're trying to do is show you and encourage you to practice the amount that you need to get fast enough to be able to do these things in real time without thinking about them, and do them quickly and correctly. So it is, the person who's going to benefit most from one of our classes is somebody who's willing to do some work. Who's, if you just like, hey, I want to sit there for 3 hours and listen to what you say and then go do it. I mean, that'll work if you're looking for a pretty small increase in your score. You might be able to, sit and listen to a class and, pick up a few tips that are going to help you increase your score by a few points. But if you want a significant increase, you got to work. You got to practice. It's like learning to play the piano, or it's like learning a sport. It really is. The LSAT is very much like learning to play a musical instrument or learning a sport, in that in order to do the things effectively that you have to do, you need to practice them. You need to learn effective techniques and practice them. So people who are willing to do that and ready to do that, you'll get a lot of benefit from our course. And if you're not, if you do just want to sit and pick up a few tips and learn a few cool things that'll help you increase your score by a couple points, then, sure, come on and join us. We're going to get you working anyway. We're going to make you work anyway. Anyway, that's all I got for tonight, folks. Thank you all for being here. Thank you very much. Have a good night. Check out our, like I said, our free resources page. I'll put that back up really quick as a closing comment, because we do have a lot of good stuff there. And whether you're going to take a course with us or whether you're just looking to pick up some good information, our website, our free prep options, our free prep resources are a really good place to go and to get started. So check that out. All right. Have a good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.